Welcome to the Debunkers Podcast. Buckle up, because today we're diving into something that honestly sounds completely impossible, maybe even a bit absurd.
Yeah, it's one of those things you hear and think, wait, what?
Exactly. Imagine this. You're a U.S. citizen, born here, maybe your parents were born here, you got the passport, the birth certificate, the whole 9 yards.
All the proof.
Right. And somehow you get detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I.C.E.
The very agency whose job is supposed to be civil immigration enforcement against non-citizens.
It defies logic, doesn't it?
It really does. And yet, the sources you've brought us today, they paint a pretty clear picture that this isn't some, theoretical possibility. It's a startling reality for some actual American citizens.
So our mission for this deep dive is to try and untangle why. How does an agency that says it absolutely cannot detain U.S. citizens end up doing exactly that?
And that absolutely cannot part, that's not just us saying it. You found their actual policy, right?
Yeah, got it right here. I.C.E. Policy Directive 1601.2. It states, crystal clear, that I.C.E. lacks the civil immigration enforcement authority to arrest or detain a U.S. citizen, period, full stop.
They're just not supposed to, that's the rule.
And the policy goes further. It says if someone claims they're a citizen, or even if there's just a hint, they call it indicia warranting further examination.
Right, any little sign.
Then their potential citizenship has to be investigated with, and I quote, utmost care and highest priority.
Utmost care, highest priority.
Sounds pretty definitive.
It does. It even gets specific. Immediate investigation, careful, speedy, needs legal analysis, consultation with their lawyers, OPLA or OCC.
Okay.
And get this. A memo has to be submitted for review really quickly if the person's already detained or has a detainer, within 1 business day unless there are, quote, extraordinary circumstances.
So on paper, it sounds like they've built in safeguards. It should work.
It really should. But then you look at the other sources, the reports, the stories, and the reality on the ground, well, it looks significantly different. Yeah. So let's unpack that. How does this gap happen? How does an agency with this seemingly, ironclad rule and careful process still end up detaining Americans?
Okay, where do we start? How does the mistake even begin?
Well, a big piece of the puzzle seems to be the specific legal power I.C.E. operates under. Sources, especially that Reddit discussion we looked at, they point to a federal law, 8 U.S.C. 1357A.
1357A, what does that do?
It gives I.C.E. officers the power to make arrests without a judicial warrant in certain circumstances.
Wait, warrantless arrests? Isn't immigration stuff mostly civil, not criminal? Don't you usually need a judge for a warrant?
And that's where it gets really interesting and frankly kind of concerning. You're right, immigration violations are typically civil matters.
Okay.
And because they're civil, a lot of the rights you'd expect in a criminal case, they just don't apply in the same way.
Fewer protections. Like what?
Well, think about Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. You don't necessarily get that read to you in the same context. There's no guaranteed right to a free lawyer if you can't afford one.
No public defender for immigration detention.
Generally, no. And things like speedy trial standards we have in criminal court, those don't really apply either in the same way. The Reddit source laid this out quite clearly.
Wow. Okay, so the foundational rights are different, and you mentioned warrants. Or lack thereof.
Right. So while they can arrest without a warrant sometimes under that statute, when warrants are used in the immigration system, they're often not the kind you're thinking of. They aren't typically issued by an independent judge.
Not from a judge. Who issues them then? Inside I.C.E.
Exactly. They're called administrative warrants. And according to the sources, these are issued internally by supervisory officers within I.C.E. itself.
So an I.C.E. supervisor signs off on a warrant to arrest someone for I.C.E.
One source, someone who apparently used to issue them, described the process as being basically rubber stamped themselves.
Rubber stamped themselves. That doesn't sound like much of an independent check, does it? It's not like a neutral magistrate reviewing probable cause.
Not at all. It significantly weakens that external check on making sure they've got the right person and sufficient grounds before detention happens.
So you got warrantless arrest powers plus internal warrants. That sounds like a recipe for mistakes.
It certainly creates a system with immense power to detain people without the same level of outside scrutiny you'd find in the criminal justice system.
And I think this leads us straight into maybe the most shocking part, the thing that really flips everything on its head, the burden of proof.
Yes, this came up again and again in the sources, the report on I.C.E. detention of citizens, the Reddit thread. A critical point emerges. The system often operates as if individuals have to prove their citizenship after they've already been locked up.
So wait, It's not innocent until proven guilty. It's more like detained until you prove you're a citizen.
That's precisely the disturbing implication for multiple sources. The system is described as being built for mass detention first, ask questions maybe later,
Mass detention first.
and characterized really starkly by some as guilty until proven innocent.
Wow, that completely inverts the basic principle of justice most Americans take for granted. You get swept up, and then the onus is on you while you're detained, maybe without easy access to your documents or a lawyer, to prove you're the one category of person they aren't supposed to touch.
It puts an enormous burden on the individual who's been mistakenly detained, and it creates this huge gap between that official policy of utmost care and what actually happened to someone caught in the gears.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? The sources gave some pretty infuriating examples.
Oh, absolutely. The case of Davina Watson is, well, it's stark, and it gets cited a lot. Here's a U.S. citizen who was held by I.C.E. for over 3 years.
3 years. How is that even possible? Didn't we just read the policy says investigate within 1 day if someone claims citizenship and is detained?
Well, according to the accounts, I.C.E. basically didn't believe him.
Didn't believe him, even with proof.
Even after he apparently presented documentation showing he was a citizen, they were, it seems, unconvinced, or maybe just didn't prioritize sorting it out despite the policy. There's that dark humor note again. He told them, showed them papers, and they said, suspicious.
That's beyond belief.
Yeah.
3 years of someone's life, a U.S. citizen, just gone. Because the system failed or someone didn't believe the paperwork, it flies directly in the face of their own rules.
And Davina Watson, unfortunately, isn't alone. That Reddit source mentions several others, highlighting this isn't just a one-off glitch.
Like who else?
There was a U.S. Marine veteran detained for 3 days.
A Marine vet served the country, then ends up detained by immigration authorities. That's something.
Yeah. Then there's the case of a 14-year-old U.S. citizen, locked up for almost a month.
A child. A 14-year-old citizen in detention for nearly a month.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't verify citizenship fast enough. That's appalling.
The source indicates that's what happened. And then, perhaps the most disturbing example mentioned, a mentally disabled U.S. citizen who was actually deported to Mexico.
Deported?
Yeah.
I thought the whole point was I.C.E. can't deport citizens. The policy says they lack authority.
Right, and this is a nuance the sources touch on, especially when you hear reports about children being deported.
Okay.
While sometimes headlines might scream citizen child deported, the sources clarify that often what happens is the mother, who isn't a citizen, gets deported, and she chooses to take her U.S. citizen child with her. So the child isn't formally ordered removed by I.C.E. as a non-citizen in that specific scenario.
Ah, okay. So I.C.E. isn't misidentifying the child as deportable in those cases, usually, but the child still ends up removed from the U.S. because their parent is caught in the system.
Exactly. And even in that scenario, it highlights a big issue. The system doesn't seem to have a strong, independent judicial process, specifically looking out for the citizen child's rights and status before they're effectively taken out of the country with the parent.
So the focus on mass detention and removal ends up having these ripple effects, even impacting citizens indirectly sometimes.
It really underscores how the lack of careful, individual checks can harm families, including citizens. The system's design prioritizing volume seems to create problems for anyone caught in its path.
And I guess if you are a citizen who gets mistakenly detained, you're not just dealing with the legal nightmare, but also the conditions inside detention.
That's another layer, yes.
Yeah.
While our focus is citizens, that ACLU source brought up the harsh realities inside these facilities. It mentioned cases like Kamiar Samimi, a legal permanent resident, not a citizen, who tragically died in detention.
Right.
And Ben Owen, married to a U.S. citizen, also a legal resident, who died in detention. Now, their cases involved issues like alleged medical neglect or poor facility conditions. The ACLU report mentioned things like mold and isolation. While not citizen detention cases, they paint a picture of the potentially severe, even dangerous environment that any person, including a wrongfully detained U.S. citizen, could be facing once they're inside that system. The system's failures aren't just about getting the identity wrong at the door.
So if you're mistakenly grabbed, you're thrown into a system where the conditions themselves, according to these reports, can be incredibly challenging, even hazardous.
Precisely. And this isn't just about, isolated mistakes or one bad agent. The sources really point towards systemic failures that allow this to keep happening.
Like that whole utmost care investigation policy, clearly not stopping someone like Davina Watson from being held for years.
Exactly. The ACLU report, even when talking about I.C.E. investigations more generally, points to flaws, like processes allowing evidence destruction or agents failing to interview key witnesses. If that's happening broadly, you can see how it would absolutely impact verifying something as crucial as citizenship.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? I saw on I.C.E.'s own website, they mention having a forensic document lab, like experts in authenticating documents.
Right. They have the tools. They have the supposed expertise.
But citizens with documents are still getting held because someone just doesn't believe them. It feels like a disconnect, like maybe they're not using their own resources effectively in these cases.
Or the system's priorities, maybe speed or volume, override using those tools carefully every single time. And adding to that, the Reddit source mentioned another big problem: I.C.E.'s databases.
What about them?
Described as often being outdated and sloppy.
Oh, great. Outdated databases. That just sounds like it's asking for mistaken identity cases, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially combined with warrantless arrests and internal warrants. It's like a perfect storm for errors.
It really seems that way. And then, okay, let's say the system does screw up. They detain a citizen. What happens next? Is there any accountability?
Well, according to the sources, not really. This seems to be another major gap. That I.C.E. detention of U.S. citizens report. It says when I.C.E. finally figures out they've got a citizen, often the person is just released.
Just released after potentially months or, like Watson, years.
Yeah. Maybe, if they're lucky, they get a sort of shrug and an our bad.
Our bad for potentially losing their job, their home, being separated from family, enduring detention conditions. Sorry.
Seems like it. The Reddit source was even more direct. It stated there's often zero accountability for the agents or the facilities involved in these wrongful detentions.
Zero accountability.
And no significant consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's no real downside for the agency when they make this kind of massive error, what's the incentive to prevent it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So let's recap the pieces we've seen. You've got these warrantless arrest powers from an old law. You have administrative warrants signed off internally, not by judges. You have this fundamental flip where the burden is on the detained person to prove they're a citizen. You have outdated systems prone to error. And then a striking lack of accountability when mistakes inevitably happen.
It paints a pretty bleak picture of the checks and balances or lack thereof.
It does.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about this?
Well, first, I think it means that despite the official policy saying it can't happen, the risk, even if it's statistically small compared to the total number of people I.C.E. detains the risk that a U.S. citizen could get caught in the system, is real. It's not zero.
And let's not forget, as a taxpayer, you're funding this system. That includes the costs of detaining people, including apparently citizens, and the costs tied to these inefficient processes and errors.
Absolutely. But maybe more fundamentally, this whole situation raises some really serious questions about, due process and the rule of law in general.
How so?
Well, think about it. A government agency having the power to take away someone's liberty. That's a huge power. You'd expect incredibly robust checks and balances, especially when it involves potentially detaining its own citizens.
Right.
A system where someone can be locked up first and only then have to prove they shouldn't be there, all without automatic independent review by a judge or meaningful consequences for mistakes. That really challenges some core principles of justice that most Americans probably believe in.
It's not just some abstract legal debate then. It's about the actual integrity of the system and the safety of citizens interacting with it.
Exactly. The stories we mentioned, Davina Watson, the Marine vet, the 14-year-old kid, the mentally disabled citizen deported, they aren't just anecdotes. They seem to be direct consequences of how the system is designed and how it operates in practice.
It really highlights that huge gulf between a policy written down somewhere and the actual boots-on-the-ground mechanics of enforcement.
Yeah. What's written versus what happens.
So, okay. We've looked at the official policy, the arrest powers, the internal warrants, the upside-down burden of proof, the heartbreaking real-life examples, the systemic issues like bad data and investigation failures, and the apparent lack of accountability. It's unsettling.
It is.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty critical question to mull over, one that really stems from what the sources suggest, especially that Reddit discussion. If detaining U.S. citizens isn't just a series of unfortunate random glitches, but potentially a foreseeable, maybe even an inherent outcome of a system built primarily for mass detention first, a system with, let's face it, pretty weak checks and balances built in. What does that tell us about the fundamental nature of the system itself?
And maybe what does that imply about its future if that core structure doesn't change?
Exactly. A challenging thought.
Definitely something to think about.
It certainly is. Something to chew on long after this deep dive is over.
It seems our time for today is wrapping up.
We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive.
It's always great having your input and thoughts.
But sadly, it seems we've run out of time for today.
Thank you so much for listening and for being such an engaged part of our podcast.
We always value your participation.
Until our next deep dive together.
Goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.